When I built myself my first tiny house 5 years ago and moved into it, I wanted to start a lifestyle where the point was for me to question and discover for myself how I can live in a modern society that, in my opinion, often has a very unsustainable way of using nature's resources. Resources that we depend on as a species to survive. So basically, I wanted to reframe my relationship with resources critical for survival, like heat, water and electricity, by living in an off-grid tiny house. And in particular, I also wanted to reframe the relationship that I have to the food that I eat. Indeed, another very critical resource for survival. Not taking it for granted by growing and harvesting more food in my own household. And not be viewing food solely as a commodity, but as something almost sacred and precious, just like nature itself. And just like many indigenous peoples and cultures all over the world have been doing for thousands of years whenever they eat a plant or an animal they have killed. And so by slowly rediscovering a new relationship with food, I was also slowly building what I call a sustainable food philosophy for myself. One that encompasses a growing awareness of the many different plants that I can grow and eat, how I can preserve them and what I can do to make them thrive in my garden. And also one that doesn't place man's ego in the center of nature, but instead reminds him of his humble place in the ecosystem of the planet, of which he is only a small part. So on my journey to try to discover a more sustainable food philosophy for myself, I think I have realized that I typically aim for 3 coordinates, where one of the coordinates is for the food to be relatively locally produced, because obviously if you buy food from your own local neighborhood or just eat food from your garden, the food does not have to travel that much in terms of CO2 emissions before it gets to your plate, and obviously that is more sustainable. But also in terms of the relationship that you have with your food and with nature around you, like, or maybe your community. Like if you buy stuff from your local farm shop or if you grow food in your garden, then maybe you care more for the food that you eat. You take it less for granted because you have spent time like putting out seedlings and making sure that they grow, and you have nurtured them into plants that you can eat, and therefore you take more responsibility for the food that you eat, and you care for it more, I guess, because you have spent much more time doing it. And if you're buying stuff from your local producers, you might cultivate more of a sense of community in that neighborhood with those people, because you know who it is that you support financially by buying from them. So in that way, I think there is like this very important aspect of a possible new food philosophy that is very much about people and food, and not just taking food for granted as a commodity that you can just take down from the shelf, but more looking at food as kind of a relational thing, like it is something between you and your community and you and the immediate environment that you live in. So that's like what I imagine would be part of a more sustainable food philosophy, even though I know it sounds a little bit romantic. So I just needed to escape the very hot and intense afternoon sun on the porch, because it was a little bit too much for me. But anyways, the second point of my sustainable food philosophy, or my second navigational point, is this question of eating seasonal food. And I think it has a lot going for it, because when you eat whatever is in season primarily, you are very mindful of the things that nature can deliver to you. Like the gifts from nature is something that you appreciate much more when it is that you know that you can only get this type of food for in this given period. Like I'm very much looking forward to my tomatoes here in the sunroom, but I think it will be another 3 or maybe 4 weeks before I can even harvest one. So I'm very much looking forward to that, and I know that I won't take it for granted, and just the first tomato that I pick will just be so magical. So I won't like take it for granted in any way, because I have just been waiting for that tomato. And the same goes with basically all of the other foods in my garden. They have their own season, and I'm really looking forward to eating them, and I know that it's like only for a brief period of time, and then another type of food will take over. But on a more globalized market, food market, we take things a bit more for granted, I think, because we can always buy tomatoes and we can always buy this and that, and then you don't appreciate things to the same extent, I guess. And it's also more of an ego mindset, I think. Like you can just buy whatever you want whenever you want. But I think eating more seasonal food can cultivate more of an eco mindset. Like you accept the gifts that nature can give you, and you appreciate that, but you don't take it for granted, and then you cultivate maybe a more loving relationship to the food that you eat, because you're much more aware of the changing of seasons and the changing rhythms in nature. And I think that's a very important part of the sustainable food philosophy, really, because that is something we have departed from as a culture. We take nature so much for granted, and we manipulate nature to a very great extent, and we don't always seem to care that much about the consequences. But by cultivating this more loving relationship, I guess, to nature, I think we can learn to respect nature a bit more, and I think that is something we can really train ourselves to do through the more seasonal food that we eat. Okay, back on the porch again. So the sun came around, and then it got a little bit too intense again in the sunroom, and now it's less intense here on the porch. So, but the third thing that I navigate after in my sustainable food philosophy is whether the food is organic or not. generally I try to eat organic food and only grow organic food, and like I don't like the idea that these fertilizers that are derived from fossil fuels, that they are sprayed over the fields and over the crops. And I think that we can grow perfectly healthy food without having to use all of those toxic chemicals in our food and or on our crops. But I know that a lot of people, they argue that it's not possible to grow food on a large scale to feed the entire world population. But I don't know if those people realize that like a third of our agricultural land is dedicated to animals. So if we just eat less meat and produce less animals, then we would free up a lot more space for growing vegetables. But on that note, I do eat meat, but I'm actually more of a venison type of guy, because I don't like the idea of eating industry meat for many reasons. But I like the idea that we can eat more like fish and venison, because it's more natural food. And here in Denmark we have so many deer that we have too many deer, so they run constantly over the roads and many of them get killed by cars, and that is indeed a problem. So the deer that you often see me eat here on this channel is from a deer that I slaughtered 2 winters ago now, and I've just had that deer in my family freezer since then, and I'm really enjoying it because it's healthy food and it's something that I in a way produce myself. And I'm totally fine with the fact that hunters go out and regulate the deer population, so that we don't have that many deer, because it's a horrible death for a deer to get run over by a car. And there is no scenario here in Denmark where the deers can just live happily ever after and at the same time just be growing and growing in population, because they will run into more and more cars, and it's just a big problem, and for the safety of human beings as well. So, and I actually ran deer over with my car 3 years ago now, and I didn't kill it immediately. I broke its hind legs and of course it was in such a great pain, and luckily I had my axe so I could kill it off pretty quickly, but it was just a horrible way for that deer to go out, like having to experience that. So it would be much more humane if a hunter just took it out, and if we have more hunters doing that. So that's my opinion on that subject of meat. But generally I do not like industry meat, so I try to just go with venison whenever I can, especially here on my own property. So I just went out to the field right next to my tiny house, because I realized that you can't really have a discussion about sustainable food philosophy if you don't include a discussion about how you produce food. And what you see here is an example of a conventional farm field, even though right now it's just a flower patch. But back in the day it was treated as a conventional farm field. And I think that there are some problems with conventional farming, even though it might be organic. Because what you do in conventional farming is that you try to discipline nature and you try to get as much out of it as possible without necessarily giving anything back to nature. So you have these tractors that run over the fields again and again, and they compress the soil to an extent where the rainwater cannot come into the soil and sustain life. And then once in a while you plow the soil, and then you turn the soil around. And what it does is that it kills off all of the life in the soil, like the microlife, the bacteria, the mycelium, the rainworms, the nematodes, everything. They just die when they get exposed to the sunlight. And then slowly you are degrading the soil, because more and more carbon material is just taken out of the soil. And actually, if you bend down and take some of the soil, you can just see that it's just pure sand with fertilizer. So it's not really high quality soil, because it has just been depleted over many years. And if you take a look out in the countryside, then you can maybe notice that many fields are quite a bit lower in terrain than the surrounding area because of this soil degradation. So I don't think that conventional farming necessarily is the way forward in a sustainable food philosophy. So that's why I personally have become very interested in other ways of producing food, like permaculture or regenerative farming, where the point is for you to build up the soil quality and the biodiversity. So let me just give you a small tour in the garden so you can see what everything is about. So instead of monoculture, I go for polyculture. So I have a lot of different plants, like all of these calendula, or what it's called, flowers that are edible, and the borage, and some leeks, and some carrots. And yeah, they help one another in different ways, especially by covering the ground so it doesn't dry up and you don't get a lot of weeds in it. And over here I have these crawly beans in this bed, and then they transfer nitrogen from the air and bring it down to the pumpkin below and also to the tomato. So yeah, I have a lot of beds like that. So a lot of polyculture in order to have, for me to have a great biodiversity. And then over by the fence I have a lot of fruit trees and crawly berry plants, and below I have an edible ground cover that makes sure that the soil doesn't dry up. So they are also helping one another. And this is an example of a so-called hyggelculture, or a hygel mound, which is where you dig down a lot of logs and leaves and branches, and when they decompose, the plants on top of this hygel mound, they will access those nutrients from the decomposing logs and leaves, and also the rainwater. So you don't have to fertilize the bed and you don't have to water it. So growing food in hygel mounds like this is a much more future-proof way of growing food, because we know that the climate will get worse and worse and we will get more and more droughts here in Denmark. So in my case, my garden should be able to thrive a whole lot more than the traditional conventional fields. So in that way I think that permaculture gardening could be a part of a more sustainable food philosophy for the future, because you don't have this ego mindset of just taking from nature without giving anything back, because in permaculture you recognize that you are actually also a kind of a steward of nature, and that you need to play into nature in a more positive way, so you also give something back to nature in terms of building up the soil quality and building out the biodiversity. And I think that fits pretty well into a maybe more sustainable food philosophy for the future. So, but all of this is obviously just my opinions on this subject on eating sustainably. But I'm very interested in hearing about what you guys think about this, because I know food can be a very politicized and also very controversial subject to discuss. So I think that there are a lot of great points and things to discuss that are waiting out there amongst you guys. So please do fill in with the comments so we can have a great discussion on this subject. So, but thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it and maybe even found some inspiration. See you again next time.